When we do hypothesis tests, we always assume that the null hypothesis is true, regardless if the null hypothesis or alternative hypothesis represents the claim. So we make one of two decisions: reject the null hypothesis or fail to reject the null hypothesis. And in hypothesis testing, the decision to reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis is based on a sample, not the entire population. So there's always going to be the possibility of making the wrong decision, an error. And there are two types of errors in hypothesis testing, a type 1 and a type 2 error. A type 1 error occurs if the null hypothesis is rejected when it's actually true, and a type 2 error occurs if the null hypothesis is not rejected when it's actually false. And this box shows the 4 possible outcomes for a hypothesis test. If h sub 0 is actually true and we do not reject the null hypothesis, a correct decision was made. If h sub 0 is actually true but we reject the null hypothesis, a type 1 error was made. And if h sub 0 is actually not true or false, and we do not reject the null hypothesis, a type 2 error was made. And if h sub 0 is actually not true or false, and we reject the null hypothesis, a correct decision was made. A tip is that it may be helpful to remember, reject is with type 1 error, and do not reject is with a type 2 error. As an example, let's say that a recent report states that 62% of people get their news from a social media site, and you perform a hypothesis test to determine if this is true. When will a type 1 or type 2 error occur? So the claim is that the population proportion, P, is equal to 0.62. The null hypothesis contains the equality, so h sub 0 is P equals 0.62. And the alternative hypothesis is the complement of the null hypothesis and contains the inequality, so h sub A is P does not equal 0.62. A type 1 error will occur if you reject the null hypothesis, that P equals 0.62 and the actual population proportion does equal 0.62. And a type 2 error will occur if you do not reject the null hypothesis, that P equals 0.62 and the actual population proportion does not equal 0.62. Now for the level of significance. There's always a possibility that we reject the null hypothesis when it's actually true, a type 1 error. But we can decrease the probability of this happening by lowering the level of significance. And the level of significance is the maximum probability of committing a type 1 error. It's usually noted as the symbol alpha, so the probability of a type 1 error equals alpha. And the 3 commonly used levels of significance are alpha equals 0.10, alpha equals 0.05, and alpha equals 0.01. And what these figures are saying is when alpha equals 0.10, there's a 10% chance of rejecting a true null hypothesis. When alpha equals 0.05, there's a 5% chance of rejecting a true null hypothesis. And when alpha equals 0.01, there's a 1% chance of rejecting a true null hypothesis. Alright my friends, that be the basics on the types of errors and the levels of significance in regards to hypothesis testing. I will link other hypothesis testing videos down in the description box below. Hopefully you got something out of this video. I do have more videos right there for you. Till next time, I am out of here.